it from a lot of different people said different ways with regards to how you can impact an athlete. And we all want to help the individuals, but we also have to recognize that sometimes what we say could potentially make an athlete worse or cause them to regress. So we have to be careful with the words that we use, the amount of feedback that we give athletes in a day and age where there are, high levels of information, high volumes of information out there. Being able to set up an environment for an athlete to solve a problem, give them the tools to go and find their best way to solve that problem is probably more important than, over cueing or standing over their shoulder, telling them to try this, try that, try this, and then have them completely lose their way. So I think a good approach that we like to use with our athletes is observe, understand what they're trying to accomplish, and give them the minimum effective dose of communication, that it'll take to nudge them towards that end goal. And that's a fine line to walk, because I do think, you don't want the athlete to feel like you're ignoring them, but you also have to respect that for every guy that gets better with this one cue, that same cue could take a guy backwards. So you got to have multiple different ways to help guys, and sometimes doing less is actually the right route to take. I kind of saw it from, the best athletes just went out and did. They were doers. You gave them an objective and then let them figure out a way to get there. And then I also heard from, a former athlete that I coached and a current coach at a high level, Forrest Herman, say something to the effect of just be a zero war coach, because there's plenty of coaches out there that actually, take guys backwards. So if you can just let the good athletes be good athletes and let them use you when they need you versus taking them down a path that isn't right for them, you can be a valuable coach in that way too. I had a very good pitcher early on in my career that I was responsible for helping, and he ended up being a first-round draft pick, and a lot of scouts and other coaches, well, what did you work on with that guy? I just made sure that the routine was good, the schedule was good, and then let him go do what he's best at, right, and stayed out of the way. Because he was at a point in his career, and I was at a point in my coaching career where there was a high likelihood that the more I tried to help him, the worse I could have made him. And so that was a big opportunity that I had early on in my coaching career, but also learning experience that recognize when you've got the right ingredients all out there, the athlete has those ingredients, and just let them cook. Byproducts of overcoaching, in my experience, you create a robot, create somebody that's maybe over-analytical, the whole paralysis by analysis scenario that we've heard about a lot. All the good intentions that you have with, feedback ultimately causes the athlete to be too internally focused, where they can no longer, move freely and accomplish strike throwing hard. In our case, just being the best version of themselves that's possible. So I think that's where you see just that feedback being too much, and it freezes them up. When we're looking at the kinematic sequence or how an athlete transfers energy through their body, we try to get dialed in on what order are things moving, with what timing are they peaking in velocities, and then what are those peak velocities. And any of those things are going to leave clues for where there might be an energy leak. And then we can look at different positions and spots that the athlete gets to in their delivery, and how we might choose to try and optimize those to allow energy to flow more efficiently in the kinematic sequence. A big one for me that I look at is the timing and relationship between peak pelvis velocities and peak trunk velocities. Is that happening with good timing and rhythm? Is the trunk rotating fast enough? And from there, you can start to dive into, does the athlete clear their hips well? Is the trunk stacked? Is it closed? And what does that need to look like for that individual based on maybe their movement preferences or the type of athlete they are, and help them learn how to, load better and unload better into foot contact so that they can time up hips and trunk more efficiently. If you get those things, moving the way they need to, and you've got the right horsepower in the engine, so to speak, that energy is going to get to the baseball. So we try and keep it fairly simple, and talk about, does it go at the right time in the correct order with good speeds? If not, what do we think is causing that inefficiency? Let's look at you, what type of athlete are you? What movement options do you have? How can we build a plan around optimizing what you're capable of, build a better athlete alongside of that, and get more energy to the baseball. So in terms of timing of peak pelvis velocity, we don't really value how fast an athlete rotates their hips open. We see guys that rotate them open slowly. We see guys that rotate them open quickly. And that doesn't seem to be as impactful as the timing of when peak pelvis velocity happens. Generally speaking, we're trying to get that to happen right around foot contact, or maybe 10, 15 milliseconds after foot contact. And athletes are able to do that by getting their hips into a advantageous position for their body type. It has a lot to do with stride direction, amount their hips rotate open, amount of hip internal, external mobility that they may have at the front hip. Those things all play a role in timing up peak pelvis velocity well. If the typical thing that we see is the pelvis peaking really late, usually by someone not matching up stride direction with pelvis positioning, or overstriding, striding too close, too open for their body type and movement preferences and biases. When that happens, you just have a smaller window of time to get energy into the trunk and then ultimately through the arm and into the baseball. So everything's really you've got to be able to compensate really well somewhere else to be able to throw the ball hard and accurate and consistently. So the most common thing that we see at that point in the kinematic sequence is late pelvis timing. Some guys can overcome that. We definitely look at it on a case-by-case basis, but I would say that's a common trait that we see as far as the pelvis speed and timing in the kinematic sequence. Yeah, November for most of our athletes, we'll use the high school group. In this case, most of them are either right at the tail end of their fall baseball schedule, or have been, in that offload, deload progression for about 4 weeks already. So they're either moving into the end of their deload progression, throwing wise, or starting it. Either way, the biggest focus for those athletes is really happening in the weight room. Okay, adding some volume, more frequency in the weight room, building that strength base. But I think something that's worth noting is that there still is some throwing that's happening. And it's important for the athlete to kind of take a 30,000-foot view here and say, okay, what are my responsibilities on the throwing side? What are my responsibilities in the weight room? And look at that, over the course of a week and then over the course of the month, and understand what we're building towards. For most of these athletes, it's that end of February timeline when they move back into team practice with their high school programs. And if you can kind of take that, chunk approach, a month here, a month there, and understand, how things are going to progress, it's much less about, okay, what do I have today, and just trying to do that. It's, okay, what is the bigger roadmap, and how do I execute within that to build versus, trying to scramble once, the end of December comes, New Year hits, and trying to flip a switch. Slow and steady build up from throwing standpoint, getting after it in the weight room early on, and making sure that we're making deposits there as well. Elite guys in November are consistent, I think is the word. Those guys show up often. Those guys know what their weeks are supposed to look like. They're very proactive with their approach and engagement with their development plans. They are focused whenever, it's kind of like when they show up to the ballpark, we all know the guys that once they cross the line, they're a different type of guy. The higher level athletes that we've been around, the well-skilled, devoted high school athlete, when he walks through the door, there's kind of a switch flipped where he's now very dialed into what that routine looks like for the day, and he's on a mission for this week. Okay, he kind of regathers himself on a Sunday, looks out over the next week, and he just stacks those days, those weeks, those months on top of each other. I would say that's the biggest separator between the guy that's interested in getting better versus the guy that's committed to getting better.
Artlist.io